get in, just letting everybody know. Probably some of you already know what F.I.V.E is, but just sharing a little bit about it in case you're new to us. So F.I.V.E stands for 5-MeO DMT Information and Vital Education. And our mission at F.I.V.E is to help shepherd 5-MeO DMT into the world in a safe and effective manner. Our website includes over 30 pages of free information on 5-MeO DMT, including integration specialists, monthly webinars, scientific research, and more. In addition, F.I.V.E is known as the gold standard in 5-MeO DMT trainings, bringing over 35 plus guest teachers and speakers over the course of 9 months to provide students with the best education possible, with our next cohort beginning in September 2024. And F.I.V.E emphasizes and encourages a collaborative approach to this work and is proud to partner with individuals and organizations working towards a similar cause. And yeah, we're just super excited to have everybody joining this webinar. For our beautiful speakers here, we'll get to hear a little bit more about who these speakers are, but we have Sara Snedeker, who's an incredible integration specialist for F.I.V.E. Also, Otto Maier, who's our director of integration here at F.I.V.E. And James Sanders, who is an amazing researcher who we got to collaborate here with, I think in January for a study with UCL and Imperial.
Yeah, awesome. Well, first of all, let's just get the fun disclaimer out of the way, the good old CYA. So, F.I.V.E is focused on providing the world with resources to educate, inform, and promote harm reduction. The content of this webinar has not been evaluated by the FDA. 5-MeO DMT should not be used to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease or condition. F.I.V.E does not endorse or promote the use of 5-MeO DMT and does not encourage or condone any illegal activities. You are solely responsible for understanding and complying all laws that may be applicable to you. Now that that's out of the way. So, as I was just saying, but some of you may not have heard, if any questions come in, you'll see there's a little questions section where you can write them down and post them in. We'll do a Q&A at the end of this panel. And that's about it. You know, let's have some fun. Let's get into a beautiful, beautiful topic that I think is very, very, very important and very timely in the psychedelic space right now.
Yeah, and I wonder maybe our lovely speakers want to just give each a little high level of who you are and what you do, so our viewers can get to know you a little bit. Maybe we'll pass it over to James.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited for the conversation. And yeah. So I'm a researcher. I'm a phenomenologist. I'm a psychologist and a cognitive neuroscientist as well. And I'm working with the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London. So there I'm working specifically with the DMT research group under Chris Timmerman. And we're studying the subjective and brain effects of both NN-DMT and 5-MeO DMT. And we're working with healthy research participants. So it's more on the side of consciousness research than clinical research. But of course, the two are interrelated. So we've been studying 5-MeO in naturalistic settings for a number of years. And I have to shout out to Malin Udhag as well, who's been a big driving force behind that. But we're also now working with 5-MeO DMT in the lab. So yeah, I'm connected to Tendava, as you already said, through the very enjoyable research that we did at the beginning of the year out there, but also connected to F.I.V.E because F.I.V.E have been advising our team on participant care as we go into dosing in the lab. Leave it there for now.
Thank you, James.
So all right, Otto.
I was just getting actually an answer for the question that was in the chat. Awakening Divinity, I've got a really specific answer for defining integration that I'd love to go over. My name is Otto. I am the head of, or director, is that my job? I'm the director of integration at F.I.V.E and Tendava. I've been an integration specialist for the past, I think, 8 years now. I use a blend of internal family systems work, somatic experiencing, depth psychology, transpersonal psychology, as well as a wealth of personal experience working with hundreds of people's experiences at this point and having the opportunity to work at Tandava and have had a lot of time just, yeah, really listening to people's process for maybe right after their experience up until years after having sat with this molecule. So yeah, really excited to be here and excited to be able to talk about something that I think is really specific when it comes to 5-MeO and is also something that is really under spoken about, which is the integration process and what is really specific and unique to the integration process of 5-MeO specifically.
Yeah, thank you, Otto.
Good to have you here. Thank
Mhm.
you. Sarah.
Hi, glad to be here. My name is Sara, and I've been working as an underground guide and integration specialist for almost a decade now. And I've gotten to be with Tandava for the last 2 years, supporting folks in their integration process. And that's been so, so lovely and inspiring and beautiful work that you guys are doing. So I draw on a few different modalities. Some of those overlap with Otto internal family systems, somatic-based modalities like Hakomi, energy healing, creative processes, yeah, and nature-based practices as well. So that's a little bit about me. Thanks, you guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah. Well, all right, family. You know, I think before we even dive into the questions that I've already got planned for you, I think that answer, Otto, I'd love for you to actually read that question aloud from our dear friend at Awakened Divinity and your response, because I think a good definition to start everything off of what is psychedelic integration.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that this question was asked because I find that in the psychedelic industry, if you want to call it that, I think that the term integration is rarely specifically defined. It's really kind of like vaguely understood, right? So I'd love to have the opportunity to dive into maybe a little more nuanced approach to yeah, what are we talking about? What is integration? Is it just the time period after an experience? Is it a practice or is it a modality? So this is a running definition that I've worked on that I would love to hear from the group if it feels resonant. So for me, my running definition for integration is an ongoing process of metabolism, embodiment, and continuous relationship building with the psychosomatic impact of a psychedelic experience. This process may include, and is not limited to, spiritual practices, psychological healing modalities, ontological reorientation, heightened self-awareness, amplification of psychological processes, both neurotic and healthy, as well as both practical and perceptual changes to one's fundamental life experience. Yeah, we'd love to hear from the group how that lands.
I think all I can say is no notes. I think it's a really nice definition. I mean, it's quite broad, but I mean, it captures anything that I would want to comment on about the integration processes that I've witnessed. So no notes.
I love it.
Yeah, I like what you said, Otto, about the metabolizing. It's an ongoing process, the integrating, and then the kind of meeting people where they're at as far as spiritual practices, other practices, therapeutic practices that might support them. So captured beautifully.
Perfect. Well, for us to dive in here, you want to hit the first question?
Yeah. All right. So this is for everyone in the group.
Anyone who wants to chime in.
Yeah. In your own words, what is one of the main differences in the 5-MeO DMT integration process from all other psychedelics? You guys can just feel free to unmute yourselves whenever. Yeah.
I can start. I would say, well, first, I think that there are many that make 5-MeO integration quite unique. The first thing that sticks out to me as maybe the most like salient or like the strongest is the somatic imprint or the somatic reverberation from the experience can be quite intense and unique in that I find with other psychedelic experiences, you can almost like, you can awaken your relationship to it. You can recall the memories or you can like bring it up. So you're in the driver's seat there, where I feel like with 5-MeO, typically what's happening is it's happening to you. You are experiencing these intense waves or reactivations, and there's not a lot of sense of I'm the one controlling and going back to having a relationship. It's more like it's it's happening in my nervous system right now in real time, and that can be quite a unique thing to work with.
Thank you, Otto. Anybody else want to add a little to that? What do you think some of the differences are?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Just kind of piggybacking on what Otto said around the sort of somatic reverberations that occur. I think something else that really makes 5-MeO a unique psychedelic to work with in the integration process is that it's a psychedelic that the onset is so rapid and can sometimes have an intensity to it, especially in the fullest expression of the medicine experience. And so sometimes people can be a little bit disoriented after an experience with quick ego dissolution and all of the things that come with it. And so that kind of finding out where they are in the ineffability of having an experience rapidly onset, that there might not be language or words to necessarily describe what they're experiencing, and then also experiencing something wholly so different on an energetic level, on a somatic level, especially if they've worked with other psychedelics before. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I can add a little bit. I misread the question earlier, and I thought I didn't realize I just had to choose one. So it's a little bit hard to choose from my list in my notes. But the top of my list was that I think that compared to other psychedelics, 5-MeO is even more personal, even more existential. And I think that the experience really gets to the root of who and what you are. And in that sense, it cuts very, very deep. And so people are visiting just these incredibly vulnerable states. The level of vulnerability under 5-MeO DMT, I think, is greater than with other psychedelics. Of course, it's there with other psychedelics, but it's even more so with 5-MeO. And that's because of the specific nature of the experience, which I think we'll get more into with further questions, but also because of the common disassociation between the inner perspective and other people's perspectives on you during the experience. So people can be acting out things that they're not even aware of, and it just adds to this level of vulnerability when everything's on show, and sometimes you're not even aware of it yourself, and that can be that can really contribute to integration as well. It's an extra thing to integrate.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, James. That actually dovetails perfectly into this next question, which is for you, Mr. James. So you've been doing a lot of interesting research around the microphenomenology of 5-MeO DMT. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and what are some of the differences you've seen with 5-MeO versus other psychedelics?
Yeah, sure. So this is an absolutely massive question. So just I'll try and keep it precise, but let's see. You can tell me if I need to shut up at a certain point. But there's kind of two big questions here. The first one is about microphenomenology and what that is. So I didn't say this earlier, but my specialization is in qualitative methods. So I interview people about their experiences. And specifically, I interview people about the phenomenology of their experiences. So phenomenology, it's the science, the scientific and philosophical study of subjective experience. So subjective experience as an object of study. And then microphenomenology, it's a very specific interview and analysis method that we use to create rich and systematic descriptions of a lived experience. So for us, typically in a study, we'll measure someone's brain, often using EEG, during their acute experience. And then shortly after, I'll take them to a quiet place and we'll talk for around an hour. And using that kind of very technical and precise method, I'll guide them to give that rich and systematic description. And this level of richness and systematicity, it's important for our research, because when we compare subjective experiences to brain data, we want a really high quality description of the experience, so that we can really uncover the nuances in the relationship between those two perspectives, the inner perspective and then the outer perspective of the brain measurements. So one extra thing I'll say about microphenomenology that sets it apart from other interview methods is this thing called evocation. So at the beginning of an interview, and then very often throughout the interview, I actually invite the interviewee to let the moment come back. So this means that they immerse themselves in the memory of the experience, or you could even say they re-embody the experience. And this is ideally to the point that they're more there in the experience than they are with me in the interview context. And then from within that state, I guide them to describe their experience. So that's the first sub-question in your question. The second question is about phenomenology of 5-MeO DMT and how it compares to other psychedelics. So a big caveat is that while I've done many interviews, I think we're at around 80 interviews, something like that now, I haven't actually started the analysis process on them, or I've just done a small amount. So anything that I say now is quite preliminary. It's not really sitting on a formal analysis, but having done so many interviews, I think I can quite confidently start to talk about it. So I think an easy way to talk about the difference between 5-MeO and other psychedelics is for me to compare the other one that I'm most familiar with in my work, which is NN-DMT. So usually when people say DMT, they're talking about NN-DMT, which is the main psychoactive compound in ayahuasca, but also used as a freebase thing. This is also a very complicated question, but in phenomenology, we differentiate between content and structure. And you can think of content as like the what of experience, what was experienced. And you can think of structure as how it was experienced. And under DMT, there's a lot of content. There's a lot of what to describe. So people might describe encounters with entities, landscapes, objects, this kind of thing. But under 5-MeO DMT, there's typically a lot less content to focus on. There's not so much what, and the much more notable changes are in how things are experienced. So, for example, even though it's considered a psychedelic, many people say that there's no visual aspect to the experience at all. So I can start to take you through some of the specific effects. At low doses, it's typically very intense bodily and emotional experiences. So people might describe energy moving through the body or being released from the body, or experiencing, these very intense emotions, almost like pure emotions. And it can be very raw and personal, or it can even be dissociated, like it's not my emotion, it's just emotion that's coming through me. But then as we start to move up in the doses, there's, things like thought and concepts starting to collapse, until you get to the point where you maybe have a prototypical peak 5-MeO DMT experience where it's maybe easy to describe it in terms of what's not there than what's there. So no space, no time, no body, no thoughts, no sense of a self who is the experiencer. And it might be described as an experience of nothing. But I would say just as commonly people say it's everything and nothing, both of those things together, kind of that non-duality. So this can happen under NN-DMT as well, but it's a lot less common. 5-MeO is much more reliably sending people to that space. I think I've already said too much. There's more I could say, but I'll leave it there for now.
That's been great. No, that's been great, James. Thank you so much. That's been really beautiful. And yeah, just to note, we had a lot of volunteers who came through our EEG study earlier this year here at the Tandava Center, who noted that they really, really enjoyed the process with James, going through that that type of interview. They said it really kind of helped them tap into some deeper layers of the experience, and that's really special. You want to get the next?
Yeah. Okay, next one's for Otto. What are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen in the integration process with 5-MeO DMT? And could you give us one or two examples?
Hard to pick one. I would say, or maybe I can give like maybe a more meta answer. I would say I think the fundamental challenge is in how actually big the experience can be, right? So I think sometimes it's maybe impossible to imagine what it might mean to have an experience like this when you have obviously never had the experience, right? Like people can talk about how big it is, people can talk about how transparent, it's beyond time and space and all of these things. But I think sometimes the repercussion of its bigness can create a unique circumstance where I think of Pandora's box. I think the unique circumstance of this medicine is once the box is opened, it can be very difficult to put the process or put the experience back into some type of conceptual box that I can maybe compartmentalize and go back to my life and then maybe like tinker around with it, maybe when I have space or something like that. So I think sometimes what can happen is if someone isn't fully prepared for that box to be opened, and then that box opens and they're in there, they go into their life and realize, oh, I can't, this experience goes beyond just my time at the retreat. It's a process that is now continuing. I think that can create a few challenges. One being, if I didn't make room for this experience to unfold after my life, there tends to be this kind of somatic presentation of panic, overwhelm, anxiety, and a situation where my life circumstances are overwhelming me, right? So imagine like trying to juggle the biggest experience of your life while raising kids, or juggling your job, or like going back to the the 9 to 5, whatever that is, while this process within you is totally really deeply unfolding. So I noticed that maybe for an example, there'll be these psychosomatic presentations of that process not having space, or that bigness not having room to totally unfold, right? So I'm thinking of an example of someone who had a process and his intention was to deepen in connection with his family, right? And a lot of his life he spent working. It's like a very high level lawyer, spent a lot of time, at work, not connecting with his family. During his process, as James said, was profoundly vulnerable. It's like more vulnerable than I think he was aware of. A lot of the emotion that was coming through was, I think, outside of his own awareness, right? So it was very big, maybe even too big in some ways. And as he came back, he was having all of these realizations after this big somatic expression of where the disconnect from his family and where his connection to work was coming from. Why was I working so hard? Why am I spending all this time working? Right? It was like coming from this maybe like core, you call it like attachment wounding, right? So he had a clear path to working towards opening. But as he went back into his life, he went back into his old patterns. And as he went back into his old patterns, he developed this very intense panic and anxiety, had a very intense reactivations every night, was having a really difficult time sleeping. And as he came to me, he was worried, did I do something that is fundamentally like destroyed my nervous system? Have I made a big mistake? This medicine didn't work? But as we worked together, basically what we did was we created space for the experience, space for the somatic presentation of what was going on, space to listen to what was coming through his body. And as we made space and room for that experience, what came through were a deeper story of what he experienced, of his tears, of basically the part of him from an IFS lens that wanted to connect with his family, had all of this deeper emotion, all these things that it needed to express. And this was overwhelming. So he compartmentalized the experience, wanted to go back to habits. So the reason I bring this up is because I think a lot of times what can be really challenging is, I think it's very difficult to change. And just because we do a medicine doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be also difficult to change. But I do think what's unique about F.I.V.E. is F.I.V.E. sometimes creates this experience, well, now you have to change. Well, now something is definitely going to present itself in an intense way where, well, you're either going to have debilitating anxiety or you're going to change. And I think sometimes that can be tough to wrestle with, and it's great to have someone who can support you in that process. But I think to answer the question, I think that's where sometimes it can get a little challenging.
Yeah, thank you, Otto. Yeah, those are some, it can get a little hairy, especially when people aren't fully aware of how big it can get. So this next question, Sarah, is for you. And actually, and Otto, if you want to chime in too, but can you share a bit about the somatic aspect with 5-MeO, Sarah, being, as that is one of the modalities that you work with? Kind of what I'd love to hear from both of you actually is the somatic aspect of the experience, a bit more about it, but also how somatics can possibly be used as a therapeutic intervention or as a therapeutic modality in the integration process.
Yeah, great question. So somatics in relationship to 5-MeO DMT, the first thing that comes to mind is something that James had named initially around the kind of lighter to medium dose ranges, where there can be more of an emotional tone and sort of the felt sense in the body pretty quickly, the intensity of our sensations, that dial gets turned up. In a way that we aren't ordinarily used to experiencing our body. There might be modalities like breath work or ecstatic dance that kind of get energy moving in the body a little bit. But 5-MeO DMT uniquely is like a quick, sudden expansion of our awareness of energy and sensations as it's moving through the body. And one of the things that can happen as the mind is kind of, where the ego defenses are kind of softening or temporarily stepping back, is this innate healing wisdom of the body, of like knowing how to move energy through the body. So that might look like, this also touches into some of the vulnerability piece of how this might present and show up in the body, of making sounds, very expressive and dynamic movement in the body that is not our normal conditioning, our social conditioning, or like what we might say is out of the range of the norm. And I think that for integrating an experience somatically, as much as we can kind of normalize becoming more fully human, and what comes with that is sensations and emotions, and how that shows up in the body, making that okay after the experience, also making that okay to like really trust the rhythm of the body, what your body needs, what kind of movement, what kind of sound, what kind of breath. The less we can like edit, suppress, or like compartmentalize that process, the more that sort of natural, authentic flow of energy, sensations, even like repressed trauma that shows up in the body can kind of move and unwind and work itself out.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. Otto, anything to chime in there?
Yeah, Sarah, I love that answer so much. Especially, yeah, the tapping into what James said about like it being profoundly personal, profoundly vulnerable, and that being something that's just happening, right? And can be kind of like a shock to even come into awareness of like what was accessed, right? Somatically, especially if it's like really strong or really potent or really outside the realm of like what feels safe or what feels like related to how I perceive myself. I think something that I really use a lot with folks that I work with are kind of some of the fundamental assumptions of F.I.V.E, of somatic experiencing. There's one idea that I find really can be really useful is over and under coupling, which is this kind of this notion that there are experiences in our awareness that can be related or bonded together, and they can be over or under associated with each other, right? So in an experience like 5-MeO, there can be so much going on, right? It's hard to differentiate what's going on at one time, right? So a lot of people are experiencing, in some senses, in some cases, both immense beauty and terror at the same time, right? So SE does this thing where it allows us to slowly go into the process of, can we like, is there any room to uncouple these two sensations? Meaning, can I experience the bliss and the terror? Can I go back and forth between these two? And when I go back and forth between these two, what happens? Because oftentimes what happens without integration is all of these sensations become one knot. And that knot is experienced as overwhelm or just terror. So a lot of times I find that there's experiences where people are like, I had this terrifying experience. And as we slow down into SE or into uncoupling, there can be this moment of like, oh, actually there was like this really intensely blissful moment amongst this also terrifying experience. And it can be really helpful for the integration process to just have that moment of like, oh, we can pull these things apart and there are two specific sensations happening here. So I think that's where somatics can be like such a immense tool to use.
That's awesome. Thank you, Otto. James, I'm curious if you guys have been seeing any kind of highly somatic experiences during the current studies you're doing. Any participants kind of reporting somatic releases or anything like that? Anything that you're able to share?
I can't share anything
No
on
worries, no
the lab
worries.
study. I'm sorry, because we're still only halfway through data collection. So the less is known, the better right now. Yeah, I can't
right.
put it out.
Give me all your info. Awesome. You want to get the next one?
Yeah. All right. This next one, Otto and Sarah, please explain to us what the difference between a traumatic experience versus a challenging or difficult experience.
I think this is most possibly one of the two most important questions in this entire webinar.
Totally.
All right, Otto, I just saw a hand.
I can start to dive in, and then after Sarah shares, I'm sure I'll have more. So maybe we could like go back and forth a little bit. Huge question. Again, obviously, very, very big question. A few things that I notice is I did a lot of interviews for the training that F.I.V.E will be coming out with soon, the integration training. I asked the community to share, like people who have had traumatic or difficult experiences to reach out. And I did a bunch of interviews, about 30 different interviews. And what I've what I noticed was the big difference between a difficult journey and a traumatic one was traumatic experiences had a few different hallmarks. One would be a lack of a proper container. So working with someone who maybe isn't qualified or can't hold a safe space, and we can go into like what that would look like. Another quality that I noticed is, which was pretty wild to witness, was that in every story that I heard from folks who had traumatic experiences, as they told the story, they vividly remember upon reflection moments that their body told them no, moments that parts of themselves said, I actually don't feel safe. I actually don't want to do this. And some other part of them overrode or fawned or felt like I have to do this because I already got myself here, or I already paid for the ceremony, whatever it was. There's this usually this consistent thread of like, I wasn't a full commitment. I wasn't fully feeling safe, and then I did it anyway, right? So I think that can create a pretty large opening of intense vulnerability without the container to hold the vulnerability. And then another element that I think is part of that is dosage. You know, people getting the wrong dosage and getting like really blown out of the water, having a whiteout experience. And I think maybe one of the more fundamental elements of traumatic experience is a lack of preparation. So a lot of times I think what that looks like is people not properly being informed on what they're really getting themselves into. What does it really mean to sit with 5-MeO versus, I don't know, something like a gram of mushrooms? You know, if someone thinks or associating these two, it's a psychedelic, right? If there isn't this like, hey, this is a pretty big experience. This is what you can expect from this experience, right? So if that all of those points aren't hit, it can lead to a traumatic experience. With a difficult experience, I think that could be focused more on like content and what came up during the journey. That can be really challenging, but they were properly prepared. They said they were fully in a yes in their body about doing the experience. They had the right container. They had a great facilitator, and they had the proper dosage. So I would say that to me feels like a clear kind of distinction between the two.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add there?
Yeah, happy to add. That was, yeah, beautifully the distinction between the two, really beautifully said. Yeah, something that I could add to it that I've seen in my own practice or experience when folks have reached out for integration outside of, Tandava or my own client base, sometimes have been people in kind of a crisis afterwards. Mostly due to facilitators who are traveling around from spot to spot and there's no aftercare. That would be one thing. Or they have no way to get back in contact with them. The second thing would be larger groups with really vulnerable content coming up and the container not being tightly held or trauma informed. When people are going to these vulnerable spaces, the after effect of that adds another layer of content and healing people sometimes need to metabolize. And then the third one, which Otto had mentioned, what I see also with folks who are not probably adequately trained or informed with this particular medicine is over serving people and kind of blowing their nervous systems out. And so the reactivations and the sleeplessness, you can expect some reactivations, especially with people kind of first working with this medicine for the first week to 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. But I've seen 3, 4, 5 weeks even. And that takes a huge toll on somebody's system. But challenging experiences, I think something that sets that apart from being traumatic is that the challenge could come in the form of emotions, sensations, hidden material, hidden parts of ourself that maybe we have kept secret from ourselves. I wouldn't call that traumatic. I would just say that in a way, 5-MeO also can be kind of a fierce, clear mirror to getting into the nooks and crannies, to the different parts of ourself that we maybe are aware of and we maybe are not aware of. So being adequately prepared for this content coming up, being held in a really safe container with a lot of compassion and non-judgment and freedom to express, those challenges can be so liberating in how we reorganize ourselves around those experiences. So.
I can add just a little bit, maybe a comment and a question here. My comment is that, you know, for me as a researcher, we're carefully screening people who participate. So I don't see traumatic experiences very often in research. I can really only think of one or two that I would maybe start to put into that context in naturalistic settings. I haven't seen any in the lab. Just to kind of concur with what Otto was saying about this this sense of commitment to the experience, I think what's commonly been described to me is, well, in the few cases that I've seen, is people taking their dose and then in that moment, just before it hits, thinking, I don't trust these people, or I didn't prepare enough for this, or something, and it just seems to knock them into this this alternate pathway into a very very difficult experience that they seem overwhelmed by, kind of outside of their window of tolerance. But the question that I want to ask, it's kind of related to what Otto and Sarah were talking about. So you're describing these traumatic experiences happening in a context where maybe the facilitator isn't the best trained, there maybe isn't the best support, there may be maybe the dose was too high. But I've been in research contexts. Well, you know, I just know of people who go to ceremonies and that's the case, you know, maybe that it isn't the best facilitator, maybe the dose is too high, but still in those contexts, some people are having blissful, wonderful experiences and some people are being traumatized. And I'm not saying this to put responsibility onto the participant, because I think it's right to point out shortcomings in the safeguarding of people first and foremost. But I'm curious about what it is that separates those people. Why some people can tolerate that poorer level of care more than others. And I think there's something interesting there in the narratives that we make about experience, how we make meaning of what we've been through. So yeah, I'm curious if anyone else has thoughts on that.
Really appreciate this question a lot. Yeah, I think for me, the first thing that just flashed through my mind when I hear that is complex trauma, is history of complex trauma and how that impacts the nervous system, and how that also, I think, particularly with complex trauma, how that affects the way in which we negotiate consent and what we're consenting to, what we think is right for us as someone who suffers from complex trauma, what is okay for me and what's right for me, and who I can trust. You know, a lot of times that can be a really muddy relationship that, like you said, becomes clear when the pipe is on my lips and I'm, oh my God, I'm actually having this like moment of clarity where like, this is actually not what I need. This is not actually how I feel. I'll leave it at that.
All right.
Yeah, what just adding on to what Otto said around, complex trauma showing up in that space, especially, you know, the attachment wounding, the relational wounding. Our content can kind of come in and overlay in the present moment experience when we're in an altered state. And so that, you know, uncoupling that Otto was talking about can be a process afterwards. And the other thing that I think might set people apart in these experiences is sometimes with the facilitation, if somebody's getting a large flood dose, and the psyche and the person not being kind of adequately prepared, I think there's an element of consent there of when you're sort of walking from the shallow end and you're getting a taste and a sense of like, oh, this is what this is. And this has the possibility to go a lot deeper and a lot bigger. And so from this place, can I, make a choice to kind of keep going or like know where my own boundaries are to stop? And so I think when there's just one large or two large flood doses given to a person, they lose that sort of informed consent around what I'm stepping into and is there choicefulness around it versus, completely submitting to the experience because the dose is so high.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think one thing I just wanted to kind of highlight, and it was touched on in various times by all three of you, is the idea that any session with 5-MeO, even well held, can be an experience that can become traumatic if not held well. So even if we've got perfect preparation, perfect facilitation, this 5-MeO experience can bring up a traumatic memory that I didn't even remember. Something could have happened to me when I was in the pre-verbal, pre-memory stage, and I might not have any idea. And it comes up in there. And generally, I'm going to go into a bit of a melting process from there. That's going to be a pretty significant, rocky integration process. And this can be one of the most beautifully deep experiences of going within myself, or if not held well, can become a traumatic experience.
Maybe just one quick thing to add is that from what I've observed, even the best experiences people have described to me as challenging. So to have a 5-MeO experience that's free of challenge, I've heard almost no stories like that at all. So no one should be out there thinking that there's something wrong with their experience if they've had some level of challenge. It's intense.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I'm really glad that you touched upon that because I think a lot of people will come into this experience hoping that they don't have a challenging experience. And one of the things that we talk to our participants about is reframing the idea of a challenge. Instead of the challenge being something that we need to run away from or resist, instead looking at it as an opportunity or as a gift. It's the psyche showing us the areas in our journey and in our life, the places that we're holding on, the places that we're resisting. And so as the challenges not just come up on the mat, but in the integration process, we have so much to work with. It's great.
And then it's a facilitator's responsibility to inform a participant that it can be challenging. If we're promising the white light experience to everyone, we are not giving the right information, so there cannot be proper consent from our participants.
Yeah, and then when we give them the right information, then it's giving them the permission to lean into the challenge and get the jewels out of it rather than not running away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I see a hand, Otto.
Yeah, if I could add just a little bit of like myth to the conversation, the archetype of the initiation sometimes is put as the wound and the blessing. So there's a wounding that opens you to a blessing, and sometimes the way that I see that play out, as James said, is like, hey, your experience is like it doesn't have to look this one way. Where sometimes there are circles that are like, oh, it's this universal love experience. So if that's the expectation, and you have a wound and blessing initiatory experience, that can be confusing. And what I've noticed sometimes in the integration circles, when people come and support each other in community and everyone's sharing their process, there are folks that sometimes come in feeling distraught that they had a traumatic experience. And then once other people start talking about working their initiatory experience that was both wound and blessing, both deeply challenging and deeply fulfilling, I've watched people themselves settle into not only their own resilience, but their own resource, their own ability to be with what's happening and go from maybe a panic state to like, their perception about what has happened and what's happening currently starts to shift. And I think that's a lot of like the archetype in community meets the body or meets, someone's process. So I really appreciate that point, because I think a lot of times that is like pure, really good preparation. It's like making sure that someone's aware of like, yeah, what the nature of what they're getting themselves into is.
Yeah. Thank you,
Hey,
Otto.
I just want one more quick comment as well. I can say that, for all the interviews that I've done, I would say that close to half, but less than half, have been that pure white light, everything and nothing experience. So more than half of the people that I've spoken to are not experiencing that. And
Mhm.
so I think that, yeah, to expect that is it's likely that you're not going to get it. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. I'd be curious for you, Joel, because in research context, it's a little bit different. I wonder for you with your retreat participants, whether it's a similar kind of proportion of people.
I would say the deeper the healing process, the more tumultuous the experiences on the mat will be, the less chance that people will get that full release, white light, ecstasis experience. And that further goes to show that that is not what's necessary. A lot of people put all of the reliance of 5-MeO on the full release, on the full mystical experience. And yet that's not where most people need to go, nor it's where most people are going to go. You can pipe someone for days and you can't just crack right through. And if there are very vigilant protector parts at play, trying to keep them safe from something that maybe not all of their psyche's on board with, those parts, if you manage to plow them over with high doses, they're going to come back and wreak havoc over the following days, weeks, and months. We just had a participant leave a retreat this week whose first experience was only a month ago, and it was in Manhattan, and it was an underground practitioner serving in an apartment. And this participant had extreme CPTSD from pre-verbal stages of life, in the developmental stages of life. And this person with no real skill sets served him a very, very high dose of bufo. And then when he went into a very natural catharsis of screaming and letting out anger, the person responded by putting a pillow over their face because they were nervous that someone would call the cops because they were in an apartment. And so they were serving in a place where it wasn't even okay for someone to express the experience in whatever way that may be. And those parts that got mowed over because he got hit with a big pipe wreaked havoc on him for the next weeks and even months. Yeah. But I just think again, information is key. Letting people know, hey, 5-MeO is not all about the big white light experience. Yeah, it's beautiful, but it doesn't mean you're automatically going to go non-dual. That's not where all of the healing comes from. It certainly helps, but there's a lot more to 5-MeO DMT than that. And so, yeah, again, we get a big mix at retreats at Tandava, where I'd say the majority of our cases are what can be considered crisis cases, where people have been in therapy for decades, tried every medication, and are coming here as a last effort. And for a lot of them, this is the first time they're cracking that deep into the psyche. In a lot of ways, modern psychotherapy and pharmaceutical medication for some people can only take them so far. And so for some people, this is an extremely tumultuous process. And I mean, we see beautiful 180-degree turnarounds with people who have had experienced pure hell on the mat. And then we've had people come here who have had that bliss white light experience, but then just decided there was nothing to do with their integration because it felt all good and they didn't need help. And yeah, so I could go off on a whole tangent on that one. But yeah, why don't you take us into the next one?
Yeah. Okay, this is for everybody. Why is the loss of self such an important factor in the 5-MeO DMT experience?
I could start quickly on this one. So I think loss of self is something that's possible under other psychedelics, but not as reliably and as intensely as under 5-MeO DMT. And I think this is part of what makes 5-MeO DMT so intense. It's what gives it that title of the world's most intense psychedelic, is it is really, in a lot of cases, obliterating the sense of self, which can be terrifying for people. And it's why people can appraise their experience as a sort of death. You know, it's very common that people say to me, it's like I died, I wasn't there. But then this ties back to exactly what we were just talking about, is that this degree of challenge contributes to that archetype of initiation. So the loss of the self is really important in the 5-MeO experience, because this is, it's that death, that loss is what makes really rich ground for meaning making to happen otherwise afterwards. So yeah, I'll just say that.
Thank you, James. Who wants to go next?
I'm happy to add on to that. I think that there is tremendous value in the temporary loss of self, to be able to get distance from the limitations, beliefs, conditioning, concepts of who am I as this particular identity? Who am I beyond all of that? Something that I've heard participants say and clients say is, I feel like I entered into the terrain of awareness of both who I was before I incarnated into this body, and who I will dissolve back into, what I will dissolve back into after I leave this physical body. And that unitive space of interconnectedness with all life can certainly inform who we're becoming, our how we relate to others, and also give us a little bit more freedom to express ourselves more authentically when we can kind of shed some of those masks or constrictions that actually might be limiting the fullness of who we are and who we're becoming.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Or Otto, you go first before I ask a follow-up question.
I'm like, this question's so hard to answer for me. For some reason, I'm like, this is like so, like almost like too big. I feel that I think of like Jiddu Krishnamurti, and I think of how many spiritual teachings are based around a negotiation of self. What is self? Like any sort of self-discovery, self-inquiry. And I think the reason why this experience with 5 is so unique is because it is reliably an experience where the sense of self is going to, in some grand or maybe smaller way, drop out in some fashion. I think what happens is I gain the knowledge of maybe the word tree, right? But I can know a tree, I can see a tree without the word tree between me and that experience. And I think what happens in life is we accumulate so many models that come between us and the experience of my body, the experience of other people, of existence. So we're not actually experiencing reality, we're experiencing models of reality. So there's this interface. And we can be completely unconscious that that's happening. And I think the reason why that can be problematic is because I think it separates us from life. It separates us from the tree, right? The word tree doesn't help me touch it, as what Krishnamurti says, right? So I think what makes this such a profound opportunity is I think it gives you a chance to totally unplug from all the models and just be with what's there, what's left when those models have been removed for a period of time. And even if it's removed for a few moments, that can leave such an impression that can be really profound.
I love that. Thank you, Otto. James, what did you want to tag on there?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question to Sarah, actually. Sarah, you were talking about this little holiday from the self, and the positive things that can come out of that. But I've had participants describe to me a challenging experience coming back into self after being away from the self, and being like, no, I don't want to be back here. I don't want to be limited. I don't want to be in this dualistic sense of self now. I've never actually been able to speak to someone about their full integration process about that, because I only ever speak to them right after the experience. But I wonder how that plays out as integration goes on in days, weeks, months.
Yeah, I love that, James. One of the ways that I think about what you're describing is that holiday from the self. And then as the self, parts of ourself start to kind of come in, like almost like layers that are like, oh, there can be a density to that. Some of the energy, how it can be felt in the body is a density. And that can sometimes be a challenge in integration, because it's kind of has a somatic tone, has an energetic tone, and then the meaning making or the emotional or mental tone of that. And the way that I kind of hold that or think about it, one is normalizing that, but two, I think it's a little bit of our own personal development around holding paradox, and how can we like learn to stretch to include everything. We're not taking a holiday from the self to somehow like transcend our humanness. I think what we're actually learning is like, how can we learn to expand and include it all? And that includes our humanness, and that includes the different layers of our psyche. And if there is things that need to change or shift in our awareness or in how we're moving through the world, then that, you know, work can be done over a period of time to kind of metabolize and integrate. But really, I hold it as like, how can we learn to hold it all, the unitive, expansive aspects of being, and also the humanness and the parts and our ego defenses, making room for all of it.
I love it. Otto, was that a hand?
Yeah, I love this question so much. And I think of one participant or one person I worked with in particular who had an experience where in the full release, she felt completely at home in being. At home in a way that, you know, perfect. A perfect sense of being whole and being at home. And as she came into her body, she panicked and was like, needed to be held, needed to like really be like physically held, because she really did not want to come back into a limited form. And as we worked, obviously she came back into her body, and there's all this grief and all that got expressed. But what was interesting in the integration process, as Sarah was saying, was there was this really interesting present moment relationship between being in this sense of home in my body, these moments of maybe ecstatic dance or the movement practices, and the relationship between that and moments of feeling totally limited by a body, totally in pain. You know, what it's like to be in a body is there's many dimensions to it, right? And the thing that as we worked with making room, like Sarah was saying, stretching to hold both the complexity of the pain of experiencing limitation in a body, and that the body is also the vehicle that allows me to have ecstatic experiences and connection, was that insight that it's all the same body that's allowing me to have these experiences. And in that dropped like a level of I would call it like the great mother kind of archetype. It was like a love for being as it is. And that was the integration. That's what really like spread out between those two kind of extremes. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. So we've got two more questions before we get to the questions that have been posted. And this next question, Otto, I'd love to hear from you first, but I'd love to hear from everyone else on any insight. Just because, Otto, I know you support a lot of therapists who have begun to take on integration clients with psychedelic work. And I'd love to know, how might modern therapy or therapists be ill-prepared possibly for the 5-MeO DMT integration process?
I recently read an article that said modern psychedelic work has a therapy problem. So that's definitely like on my mind, is that article. But I think the first thing that comes to my mind is particularly old paradigm therapy, I'll say, because I do think that the modern landscape, maybe the last 10 years, is very different than maybe an older paradigm. We're moving, I would say, from more of a pathological based foundation to moving towards a little bit more of a creative expansion into non-pathology, meaning everything you're experiencing that's maybe some point of suffering maybe is more of a signal as opposed to a symptom and a problem that needs to be resolved. And I think why that paradigm is really unique to 5 is because oftentimes two things. One is the process can really bring up a lot of intense symptoms, right? And a lot of times those symptoms are communicating information about the process that are really important and unique. And I think if you are addressing that as a therapist from a lens of pathology, you might dampen and try to push down a process that's trying to come up and out and through. And sometimes I think, like, the analogy of the box, if you're a provider, a healthcare provider is trying to put this thing in a box, it's not going to go over well. It really needs more space to obviously come through. I think another piece that I think is also like adjacent to that is, I think it's easy to hear the subjective qualities of spiritual awakening and put those in the box of psychosis prematurely, or become very overwhelmed as a practitioner of like, I don't know how to hold this, or like, I'm afraid for this person. Where I think that if there's a more expanded, maybe transpersonal models that someone, a therapist, or maybe a more modern therapist is like really comfortable in, there can be, again, a safe space for what's coming up to be held, and a safe space for what's coming through to not be pathologized or moved around. Or I think you need to see, somebody who's like going in that direction of pathology. So I think that, I think it's super important to understand the limitations of that type of thinking and working when you're working with experiences that are really deeply non-ordinary or outside of like just the models of personality.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add on to that? I feel like it's, oh, sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
I'm gonna say, what Otto, how you, held all of that and spoke to it, I think is just really beautiful said. I think the pathologizing aspect, where I've had conversations with folks, therapists, and after, events of like, how can we actually normalize what's happening here? How can we kind of look at it through a transpersonal lens, a spiritual lens, and create the safety? Like, the more we normalize that, like, this is a big experience, and the energy that is moving through you, how can we make, room for that? It's the tamping it down or trying to compartmentalize it or put it away, actually, I find makes kind of two things happen: either the process delayed, or the anxiety, or kind of some of the more challenging emotions or symptoms that are occurring just increase. So making a lot of room, making a lot of space, really normalizing the experience, I think is so important.
I just had one thing to add that I think is important. So I think, as we're potentially getting closer and closer to psychedelic medicines being legitimized and legal and all this kind of thing, we are seeing more therapists who are psychedelic informed. So then I think an important point here is for how modern therapy might be ill-prepared for 5-MeO integration processes is just spreading the awareness that you might have a lot of know-how with other psychedelics. And I've seen people say, oh yeah, I can handle 5-MeO because I know all of this about other psychedelics. But there's specific things about 5-MeO DMT that people need to know. So people could potentially be receiving poor care if they're receiving something that is tailored for another kind of psychedelic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad you pointed that out, James. Thank you.
All right, should I shoot over to the last question?
Shoot over to the last question.
Okay, this is for everybody. How does the relationship between facilitator and participant affect the integration process?
It's an important one.
Mhm.
Who's going in? All right, I see a hand. Let's hear it.
Okay. Well, I would say immediately that there's definitely an exchange of power. I think that's the first thing, that there is some type of power dynamic oftentimes between a facilitator and a participant. Number one, the most obvious is that like you're in the hands and care of somebody in your potentially most vulnerable state, maybe in a state that's, like as James said, vulnerable beyond your awareness, right? So I think that creates a really unique power dynamic. And I would say how that plays out in the integration process, I've noticed sometimes is that I've come across a lot of folks who have told me, don't think I have a full understanding of this yet, but I've heard a lot of times people say, I feel a lot safer talking to you about my process, my integration specialist, than I wouldn't feel safe telling my facilitator. Like that there's something that feels separate about it, or maybe there's something about like similarly to working with a therapist, this therapist isn't in my life, right? So like there's the anonymity and the safety in that. So I do think that there's a power dynamic that I think is important to acknowledge, as well as sometimes it can be super helpful to have a separate person to do integration work with. I think the other thing that I noticed is really unique that people sometimes struggle with is that before working with medicine, there wasn't an explicit acknowledgement and agreements and expectations about what the facilitator is available for in terms of care after a session. And sometimes I've noticed that there can be like some trauma or difficulty because there was an expectation that, hey, this facilitator is going to hold my process for this amount of time, or it's going to look like this. And some facilitators will drop off immediately. They'll serve you the medicine and then that's it. So there can be like an attachment trigger there. There can be all sorts of things that come up there. So I do think if you're going to work with someone, to make sure that that stuff is like acknowledged ahead of time and those expectations are addressed. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about clients and that role after with integration. And it feels like it's this kind of another arc. There's the retreat, or there's the ceremonies and experiences, but then afterwards there's this whole other process that unfolds in the next few days, weeks, and even months. And I feel like being able to kind of have some connection with those that you've been serving is really important to sort of maybe track their process if it has been more challenging. It's also information for the facilitator. I think in the realm of like best practices of, continuing to check in with, the dosing, all kinds of things. I just lost my thought on the second part of that, but yeah, I think that the role of the facilitator afterwards is really important. And in some cases where it's been really challenging, it's been when the facilitator is not available, has dropped off, or might minimize the person's experience, after a ceremony. Yeah.
I think what comes up for me in relation to this question is the role of the facilitator in the client, the participant, their narrative about the experience. And so it seems to me it's a very fragile thing. Someone can view their facilitator as the healer or the sage, but it can very quickly tip over into the quack or the charlatan, And so, and there can also be this process of maybe building a facilitator up too much, so that then there's this crash. And so I don't know how a facilitator manages something like that, but it seems to me, and this is not my area of expertise, so I'm really just sharing my thoughts that come to me, but yeah, it seems to me that there's something very delicate there about the facilitator trying to maintain a narrative that lets a person go through a positive transformational process, being that role in that story and not letting that slip.
I love that. Thank you, James. Well, all right. So we're going to get to a few questions, and we're running out of time. That was a very, very great panel, really great discussion. I really, really enjoyed hearing from you guys. So for everyone who's watching, some of you, I'm not sure if you get notified if your question was dismissed. I did go through and just dismiss questions that were not relevant to the topic of the webinar. Also, people who are requesting specific protocols for specific type of cases, which we are not going to offer on a recorded webinar, as all of these answers would be highly personalized, and we would need a lot more information about the particular case to be able to offer a real question. So in the heart of harm reduction, we'll not be answering those. So I would say one that I would love to hear from Sasha. What are some common signs or manifestations of disassociation post 5-MeO? Can you bundle things such as existential confusion, guilt, shame, brain fog, meaninglessness, and/or other forms of rumination under the label of disassociation? Or is disassociation more obviously distinct? And if so, what does it look like?
I'm happy to jump in here. Well, the first thing that I would just say about disassociation is how it's universal. It's something that we all experience regardless of working with 5-MeO or not. It's also oftentimes a automatic process that happens outside of our awareness. So we don't always know when it's happening, and there isn't necessarily anything to do when it does happen. Sometimes with disassociation, we're the last to kind of know. One of the ways that I have seen this show up is somebody who has had a very overwhelming dynamic catharsis in their 5-MeO experience, that also came from unveiling traumatic material that was repressed and unknown to them. And so holding disassociation after an experience, not pathologizing it, but of making space for it, of it is a way that the psyche, the mind, and the body is giving a little bit of reprieve and like letting that be okay, that it's a natural process that tends to take its course. doesn't necessarily last indefinitely. There can be grounding things. Actually, something that can help if this is presenting and it's causing distress for somebody. Something as simple as doing like wall sits that are going to engage the muscles of the body. That can be a way to kind of ground and pull our energy, down and be really resourcing and supportive. But as a whole, it's a process we all experience, and it tends to resolve, naturally on its own from what I've seen.
Mhm. Otto, was that a hand?
I love that answer, Sarah. And I really, really appreciate this question. I love where you took it in the example of non-pathology, because I do feel like the body is just expressing itself, right? And the body is incredibly wise. So there's two directions that I would maybe take it. One is if I'm asking the question like, am I dissociating, right? To me, I would get curious about that part of my experience. Like, am I afraid of something particularly? Whereas I'm looking for this dissociative quality. Like, are my associations to dissociation negative, right? Is that something like pathologizing? I'm afraid that this is happening in my experience. So I would first want to address like, yeah, what part of me is like maybe afraid of what might be happening or is overwhelmed by that. The other piece that I think can be really useful, as Sarah said, is like, if I'm dissociating, that means that there's some sense of overwhelm that's happening. And my body is doing something really loving, actually. It's helping me be less overwhelmed. It's trying to help me disconnect from the overwhelm, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. And I think there's two directions that I found useful to work with that, depending on the degree and the severity of how dissociated someone is. I would say one is what Sarah said. I like to gently encourage people to like wash the dishes. Just really slowly feel your hand underneath the water, and just you don't have to process or feel into your body. Just like, yeah, what's it like to feel your hands on the cold water, right? Like there's no pressure there. The other thing that I find useful that can create a lot of creative insight into what someone's really needing is a mentor of mine, David Bedrick, really likes the technique of like, well, what is it like to feel dissociated? Well, I feel like I want to pull away from the screen. It's like, okay, like, well, what's it like to pull away from the screen? Well, I feel hidden. It's like, okay, well, what's it like to feel hidden? Well, I feel safe. And then if you follow that train of thought, it'll be like, sometimes it's taken people to their imagination. Well, I feel like I'm at my grandmother's house, and that feels like a really safe place to be. And it's like, okay, great. How can we create your grandmother's house in your life right now? Is that because that's what your body's kind of desiring, right? That's something that feels really resourcing, right? So sometimes the dissociation can lead to a deeper sense of resource, and I think that can sometimes be really special and helpful.
I love these answers. All right, we're going to take one more question here from the crowd, and it's from Mason. Would you recommend participants treat the experience more like a rehabilitation? It seems as though the process of integration can take a month or more. I experienced a need for some liminal space while adapting.
Great question.
Mm-hmm.
And so who wants to speak?
I guess I'm curious about how we're defining rehabilitation. In terms of like maybe a sensitivity to environment. I'm curious about how you guys would define that.
How I took the question, but it might just be how I received the question, is kind of, should people really afford themselves or kind of make an effort to make space in their daily life after returning from an experience like this? Intentionally setting the kind of incubator phase within your living space, your surroundings, things like that is kind of where I took it.
Okay. Yeah, I would say the biggest mistake that people make in their integration process that does the most harm is not doing that. Even if you have this great experience and you're resourced, you have all the support in the world. If you're then like, all right, getting on a flight, going back to New York, I got stuff to do, da 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 da. That's like a one-way ticket to overwhelm, and so much can happen for that experience. I think to really, yeah, I think as a rule, to treat your nervous system as if you're reborn in ways, and it's going to be particularly sensitive, and to plan on that. I can't tell you how many clients I've had who said like, this should be mandatory. You should at least have a week after where you're not doing anything. Like you guys recommend it, but it's got to be mandatory, and it's tough in today's world because I'm sure Joelle and Victoria, you can attest to this. When people come to the medicine, they're often like, how quick can we get this done so I can get back to my life? A lot of people can't afford in some ways to take a significant amount of time off. And sometimes that does more harm than good.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think really well said. I would say that tends to be where it's harder to integrate, or the process of integration gets delayed a little bit because of packing too much in with one's life. For many people, if you've got families and jobs, that might not always be possible, but like at a minimum, I would say 3 to 4 days if you can. 5 days is great because you don't necessarily know what this process will be like for you, what the opening will be like for you. It could be easeful. If that's the case, wonderful. But if you're a little bit more sensitive, porous, open, your perceptions of energy, or you're not sleeping as well, all of those things impact daily life and can make integration harder. So treating yourself with a lot of care and a lot of spaciousness, it's recommended, and can be really supportive in how it all integrates and lands in your system.
Joelle, you're
Look at me
muted.
muted. Yeah. As we are running out of time and I'm speaking into a muted microphone, just before we start signing off, I just wanted to quickly speak to a question that was just posted. Is toad medicine a continuous process if I'm releasing childhood traumas, or is there a point where I would know that I'm complete? I'm just going to rifle this one off very quickly. One, it's always going to be a continuous process. I think with healing process, there's never a completion. It's finding when we are at a regulated state, and also making sure that the process will continue for as long as you choose to engage with it. Smoking toad medicine or 5-MeO DMT is not going to cure our childhood traumas. It may help move some things, but the integration process and engaging with it is what will. With that being said, for everyone who is interested in learning more about integrating 5-MeO and how it is different, we are very, very excited to be releasing a new course in the next month or two, hosted by our dear friend Otto Maier. And this course is going to be a short course around the foundations of integrating 5-MeO DMT. And we have another full course coming behind it on integration itself, particularly around 5-MeO, that will be quite wonderful. But stay tuned. Next month we'll be announcing, and it'll be, for us, it's really important to get this information out there because we're all here because we deeply believe in this medicine. It's something that's had profound effects on our life, and we continue to work with it because we're able to see the profound shifts that it's able to have. But we've also seen the shortfalls. We've also seen how bad it can get without the proper support and without the proper integration. And remembering that facilitators are not integration specialists. Because I am a 5-MeO DMT facilitator does not make me equipped to guide my participants through integration. That completely depends on my training. So if you are serving medicine, particularly in taking on any cases that may have trauma or may have really anything, period, if you are not trained with integration, bring people onto your team who are, because it is vitally important. All right, you want to take us out?
Yeah, well, Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much to all our amazing panelists for making the time and space, especially you, James. I know it's super late there.
Yeah,
Thank you
thanks
so
thanks for
much.
joining us from the UK.
Yeah, and thank you to our beautiful audience. We can't wait to see you guys on the next month's webinar.
Yeah, and we will post links when we post the webinar up. We'll provide links to everybody's website, web pages, and all that good stuff, so you can get in touch if you'd like.
Have a beautiful rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks again for joining us.
Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you.